Chapter 12. Just as Selena was about to launch herself in an eyes with the captain, someone stomped a spear on the ground and called the room to attention. She faced the voice and found a stocky, balding man standing beneath the mezzanine. "Your attention now?" the man repeated. Selena looked to Cole, who nodded, taking the knives from her as they joined the 23 other competitors encircling the man. "I'm Thetis Brulo, weapons master and judge of this competition. Of course, our king's the final judge of you, sorry lot, but I'll be the one determining every day if you're fit to be his champion." He patted his sword hilt and Selena to admire the beautiful woven gold at the pommel. "I've been weapons master for 30 years and lived in this castle for 25 years more than that. I've trained many a lord and knight, and many a would-be champion of Adalin. It would be very hard to impress me." Besides Selena, Cole stood with his shoulders thrown back. It occurred to her that Brulo might have trained the captain, given how easily Cole had kept up with her. If Brulo had trained him, then the weapons master must live up to his title. She knew better than anyone not to underestimate opponents based on their appearance. "The king's already told you all that there is to know about this competition," Brulo said, holding his hands behind his back. "But I figured you lot are itching to know more about each other." He pointed a stubby finger at Kane. "You. What's your name, occupation, and where do you hail from? And be honest about it. I know none of you are bakers and candlestick makers." Kane's insufferable grin returned. "Kane, soldier in the king's army. I hail from the White Fang Mountains." Of course he did. She had heard tales of the brutality of the mounted folk from that region, and seen a few of them up close, seen the fierceness in their eyes. Many of them had rebelled against Adalin, and most wound up dead. What would his fellow mountain dwellers see if they could see him now? She gritted her teeth. What would the people of Terrasen say if they could see her now? Brulo, however, didn't know or didn't care, and didn't even give a nod before he pointed to the man to Kane's right. Selena immediately liked him. "And you?" A slender, tall man with thinning blonde hair surveyed the circle and sneered. "Xavier Farrell, master thief of Melisande." Master thief? That man? Of course, she realized. His reed thinness probably aided in slipping into houses. Maybe it wasn't a bluff. One by one, the 21 other competitors introduced themselves. There were 6 more seasoned soldiers, all of them thrown out of the army for questionable behavior, which must have been truly questionable, given that Ardalin's army was notorious for ruthlessness. Then there were the 3 other thieves, including the dark-haired, grey-eyed Nox Owen, whom she'd actually heard of in passing, and who had been giving her such charming smiles all morning. The 3 mercenaries looked ready to boil someone alive, and then there were the 2 shackled murderers. As his name suggested, Bill Chastain, the eye-eater, ate the eyes of his victims. He looked surprisingly plain, with mousy brown hair, tan skin, and average height, though Selena had trouble not staring at his scar-flecked mouth. The other murderer was Ned Clement, who had gone for 3 years under the name Scythe, for the weapon he'd used to torture and hack apart temple priestesses. It was a wonder they hadn't executed either man, though from their tanned skin, she guessed they'd spent the years since their captures toiling under the sun of Calicula, the southern sister labor camp to Endeavour. Next came 2 scarred, silent men who seemed to be cronies of some far-off warlord, and then the 5 assassins. She immediately forgot the names of the first 4. A gangly, haughty boy, a hulking brute, a disdainful rut of a man, and a snivelling, hawk-nosed prat who claimed he had an affinity for knives. They weren't even in the Assassin's Guild. Not that Arabin Hamel would ever allow them in. Membership required years of training and a more than impressive track record. While these 4 might be skilled, they lacked the refinement that Arabin favored in his followers. She'd have to keep an eye on them, but at least they weren't the silent assassins from the windswept dunes or the Red Desert. Those would be worthy of her. They'd make her sweat a bit. She spent a month training with one burning summer, and her muscles still ached at the memory of their grueling exercises. The last assassin, who called himself Grave, made her pause. He was slight and short, with a kind of wicked face that made people quickly look away. He had entered the room wearing shackles, and only had them removed when his guards, all 5 of them, gave him a stern warning. Even now they stood nearby, watching him relentlessly. As he introduced himself, Grave flashed an oily smile, revealing his brown teeth. Her disgust didn't improve when Grave ran an eye over a body. An assassin like that never stopped at just killing. Not if his victim was female. She willed herself to hold his hungry gaze. "And you," Brullo said, cutting into her thoughts. "Lillian Gordiana," she said, holding her chin high. "Jewel thief from Belhaven." Some of the men sniggered, and she clenched her teeth. They'd stop their laughing if they knew her true name, if they knew that this jewel thief could skin them alive without a knife. "Fine," Brullo said, waving a hand. "You all have 5 minutes to put away your weapons and catch your breath. Then, we're on a mandatory run to see how fit you are. Those of you who can't run the distance, go home, or back to whatever prison your sponsors found you rotting in. Your first test is in 5 days. Consider us merciful, it's not sooner." With that, everyone scattered, the champions murmuring to their trainers about whatever competitor they deemed the biggest threat. Kane or Grave, most likely. Certainly not a jewel thief from Belhaven. Cole remained beside her, watching the champions stride off. She hadn't spent 8 years building a reputation and a year laboring in Endeavor to be disregarded like this. "If I have to call myself a jewel thief again..." Cole raised his eyebrows. "You'll do what, exactly?" "Do you know how insulting it is to pretend to be some nobody thief from a small town in Fenharrow?" He stared her down, quiet for a moment. "Are you that arrogant?" She bristled, but he went on. "It was foolish to spar with you just now. I'll admit that I hadn't realized you'd be that good. Thankfully, no one noticed, and you do not want to know why, Lillian?" He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Because you're some pretty little girl. Because you're a nobody thief from the small town in Fenhar. Look around." He half turned to the other champions. "Is anyone staring at you? Are any of them sizing you up? No, because you're not a real competition. Because you don't stand between them and whatever freedom or wealth they're looking for." "Exactly. It's insulting." "It's smart, that's what it is, and you're going to keep a low profile throughout this entire competition. You're not going to excel, and you're not going to trounce those thieves and soldiers and unknown assassins. You're going to stay solidly in the middle, where no one will look your way because you're not a threat. Because they'll think that you'll be eliminated sooner or later, and they should focus their attention on getting rid of bigger, stronger, faster champions like Kane. But you're going to outlast them," Colin continued, "and when they wake up on the morning of the final duel and find that you're their opponent, and that you've been beaten them, and the look on their faces will make all the insults and lack of attention worthwhile." He extended his hand to lead her outside. "So what do you have to say about that, Lillian Godina?" "I can look out for myself," she said lightly, taking his hand. "But I have to say that you're rather brilliant, Captain. So brilliant, actually, that I might give you one of the jewels I plan to steal from the Queen tonight." Cole chuckled, and they strode outside to where the running contest awaited. Her lungs burned and her legs were leadened, but she kept running, keeping her position in the middle of the pack of champions. Brullo, Cole, and the other trainers, along with 36 armed guards, followed them around the game park on horse. Some of the champions, Grave, Ned, and Bill included, had been given long manicures. She supposed it was a privilege that Cole had unlocked her up to. But to her surprise, Kane led the pack and was nearly 10 yards in front of the rest. How could he possibly be that fast? The sound of crunching leaves and labored breathing filled the warm autumn air, and Selena kept her gaze on the damp and gleaming dark hair of the thief in front of her. One step after another, one breath in, one breath out. Breathe. She had to remember to keep breathing. Ahead, Kane turned a corner, heading north, back towards the castle. Like a flock of birds, they followed him, one step after another, never slowing down. Let them all watch Kane, let them plot against him. She didn't need to win the race to prove she was better. She was better without any kind of validation that the king could give her. She missed a breath, and her knees wobbled, but she kept upright. The run would be over soon. Soon. She hadn't even dared to look behind to see if any had fallen. She could feel Cole's eyes on her, though, reminding her to keep in the middle. At least he had that much faith in her. The trees parted, revealing the field that lay between the game park and the stables. The end of her path. Her head spun, and she would have cursed at the stitch that lanced through her side, had she had any breath to do so. She had to stay in the middle. Stay in the middle. Kane cleared the trees and raised his arms above his head in victory. He ran a few more feet, slowing his pace to cool down, and his trainer cheered for him. Selena's only response was to keep her feet moving. Only a few yards left. The light of the open field grew brighter and brighter as it approached. Stars flashed before her eyes. Swarming in a vision, she had to stay in the middle. Years of training with Arab and Hammer had taught her the dangers of giving up too easily. Then she was through the trees, and the open field surrounded her, an explosion of space and grass and blue sky. The men in front of her slowed to a stop. It was all she could do to keep from sinking to her knees. But she made her legs slow, made her feet walk, made herself take a breath after breath as the stars continued bursting before her eyes. Good, Brullo said, reining in his horse and surveying whoever had first returned. Get water. We've got more training after this. Through the spots in her vision, she saw Carl stop his horse. Her feet moved of their own accord towards him, then passed back to the woods. Where are you going? I dropped my ring back there, she lied, doing her best to look scatterbrained. Just give me a moment to find it. Without waiting for his approval, she entered the trees to the sneers and snickers of the champions who had overheard. From the approaching crushing noises, she knew another champion was on his way out. She stepped into the cover of the bushes, stumbled as the world became dark and light, and tilted. She had barely sunk to her knees when she vomited. She heaved until she had nothing left inside. The straggling champion passed on. On trembling limbs, she grappled onto a nearby tree and hauled herself upright again. She found Captain Westfall standing across the path, watching her with pursed lips. She wiped her mouth on the back of her wrist and said nothing to him as she exited the woods. Chapter 13. It was lunchtime when Brullo released them for the day, and to say that Selena was hungry would be a severe understatement. She was halfway through her meal, shoveling meat and bread down her throat, when the dining room door opened. What are you doing here? She said through her mouthful. What? Said the captain of the guard, taking a seat at the table. He'd changed his clothes and taken a bath. He'd pulled a platter of salmon towards him and piled it on his plate. Selena made a disgusted face, her nose crinkling. You don't care for salmon? I hate fish. I'd rather die than eat it. That's surprising, he said, taking a bite. Why? Because you smell like one. She opened her mouth to expose the ball of bread and beef that she was chewing. He shook his head. You might fight well, but your manners are a disgrace. She waited for him to mention her earlier vomiting, but he didn't continue. I can act and talk like a lady, if it pleases me. Then I suggest that you begin to do so. After a pause, he asked, How are you enjoying your temporary freedom? Is that a snide remark, or an honest question? He took a bite of fish. Whichever you like. The window revealed the afternoon sky, slightly pale, but still lovely. I'm enjoying it, for the most part, especially now that I have books to read whenever you lock me in here. I don't suppose you'd understand. On the contrary, I might not have as much time to read as you and Dorian do, but that doesn't mean I love books any less. She bit into an apple. It was tart, with a sweet, honey-like aftertaste. Oh, and what books do you love? He named a few when she blinked. Well, those are good choices, for the most part. What others? She asked, and somehow an hour flew by, carrying them on the wings of conversation. Suddenly the clock chimed one and he rose. The afternoon is yours to spend in any way that you like. Where are you going? To rest my limbs and my lungs. Yes, well, hopefully you'll read something of quality before I see you again. He sniffed the air as he walked out of her room. Hopefully you'll take a bath before I see you again. Sighing, Selena called to her servants to draw a bath. An afternoon of reading on the balcony beckoned. The following dawn, Selena's bedroom door opened and a familiar stalking gait echoed through the room. Cole Westfall stopped short when he found the assassin dangling from the beam of the bedroom door, repeatedly hoisting herself up to touch her chin on the wooden bar. Sweat soaked her undershirt and ran in rivulets down her pale skin. She had been exercising for an hour already. Her arms quivered as she lifted herself again. Though she might pretend to be in the middle of the pack, there was no reason to train like it, even if every repetition made her body scream for her to stop. She wasn't that out of shape after all. Her pickaxe in the mines had been heavy, and it definitely had nothing to do with her fellow competitors walloping her at the race yesterday. She already had an edge on them. She just needed it to be a bit sharper. She didn't pause as her exercising, as she smiled at him, panting through her clenched teeth. To her surprise, he smiled back. By that afternoon, a vicious rainstorm arrived, and Cole permitted Selena to walk around the castle with him after she had finished training with the other champions for the day. Though he spoke little, she was glad to be out of her rooms, and dressed in one of her new gowns, a lovely lilac silk dress with pale pink lace accents and pearl beading. But then they rounded a corner and nearly collided with Caitlin Rompier. The assassin would have grimaced, but she forgot all about Caitlin as her eyes fell upon her companion. It was an Eloy woman. She was stunning, long and lean, each of her features perfectly formed and smooth. Her loose white dress contrasted with her creamy brown skin, and a three-plated gold torque covered much of her chest and neck. Bracelets of ivory and gold shimmered around her wrists, and her feet were sandaled beneath matching anklets. A thin circlet comprising dangling gold and jewels crowned her head. She had two male guards with her, armed to the teeth, with an assortment of curved Eloy daggers and swords, both of them studying Cole and Selena closely, weighing the threat. The Eloy girl was a princess. Captain Westfall, Caitlin said and curtsied. Beside her, a short man dressed in the red and black garb of a councilman bowed to the pair. The Eloy princess stood perfectly still, her brown eyes wary as she took in Selena and a companion. Selena offered her a slight smile, and the princess stepped closer, her guards tensing slightly. She moved with an easy grace. Caitlin gestured to the girl, poorly hidden distaste written across her beautiful face. This is Her Royal Highness, the Princess Nehemia Yidger of Eloy. Cole bowed low. The princess nodded, barely a dip of her chin. Selena knew the name. She had often heard the Eloy slaves in Endeavor boasting of Nehemia's beauty and bravery. Nehemia, the light of Eloy, who would save them from their plight. Nehemia, who might someday pose a threat to the King of Ardalan's rule over her home country when she ascended to the throne. Nehemia, they whispered, who smuggled information and supplies to the rebel groups hiding in Eloy. But what was she doing here? And the Lady Lillian, Caitlin added briskly. Selena dropped to the lowest curtsy she could give without falling and said in Eloy, Welcome to Rifthold, Your Highness. Princess Nehemia smiled slowly as the others gaped. The councilman beamed, wiping the sweat from his brow. Why hadn't they sent Nehemia with the Crown Prince, or even Perrington? Why was the princess herded around by Caitlin Rompier? Thank you, the princess replied, her voice low. I imagine you've had a long journey, Selena continued in Eloy. Have you arrived today, Your Highness? Nehemia's guards exchanged glances, and Nehemia's brows rose slightly. Not too many northerners spoke their language. Yes, and the Queen sent this one, Nehemia jerked her head at Caitlin, to bring me around with that sweating worm of a man, as well. The princess narrowed her eyes at the small councilman, who wrung his hands and dabbled his forehead with a handkerchief. Perhaps he knew what sort of a threat Nehemia posed, but why bring her to the castle? Selena ran her tongue across her teeth, trying not to laugh. He seems a bit nervous. She had to change the subject, or else she'd indeed laugh. What do you make of the castle? It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen, Nehemia said, scanning the ceiling as if she could see through the stone into the glass sections. I'd sooner enter a castle made of sand. Cole watched them somewhat disbelievingly. I'm afraid I haven't understood a word you've said, Caitlin interrupted, Selina tried not to roll her eyes. She had forgotten the woman was there. We, the princess said, struggling for the word in the common language, were talking with the weather. About the weather, Caitlin corrected sharply. Watch your mouth, Selina snapped before she could think. Caitlin gave Selina a vicious little smile. If she's here to learn our ways, I should correct her, so she doesn't sound foolish. Here to learn their ways, or for something else entirely. The faces of the princess and her guards were unreadable. Your Highness, Carl said, stepping forward, a subtle movement to keep himself between Nehemia and Selina. Are you having a tour of the castle? Nehemia chewed on the words, then looked at Selina, brows high, as if she expected a translation by now. A smile tugged on the corner of Selina's lips. No wonder the councilman was sweating so profusely. Nehemia was a force to be reckoned with. Selina translated Cole's question with ease. If you consider this structure of a madness to be a castle, Nehemia replied. Selina turned to Cole. She said yes. I've never knew so many words to mean one, Caitlin said with a forked sweetness. Selina's nails dug into her palms. I'm going to rip your hair out. Cole took another step towards Nehemia, effectively blocking Selina's path to Caitlin. Smart man. He put a hand on his chest. Your Highness, I am the captain of the Royal Guard. Please allow me to escort you. Selina translated again, and the princess nodded. Get rid of her, she said flatly to Selina, then waved a hand towards Caitlin. I don't care for her temperament. You're dismissed, Selina said to Caitlin, flashing a bright smile. The princess tires of your company. Caitlin started. But the queen! If that is her highness's wish, then it will be granted, Cole interrupted. Though his features were a mask of protocol, she could have sworn she glimpsed a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Selina wanted to hug him. She didn't bother to nod farewell to Caitlin as the princess and the councilman joined them, and they strode down the hall, leaving the fuming lady behind. Are all your royal women like that? The princess said to Selina and Eloy. Like Caitlin? Unfortunately, your highness. Nehemia examined the assassin, and Selina knew she was taking in her clothes, her gait, her posture, everything Selina herself had observed about the princess already. But you're not like them. How do you know how to speak Eloy so well? Selina thought of a lie. Studied it for several years. You use the intonation of the peasants. Is that taught in your books? I knew an Eloy woman who taught it to me. A slave of yours? Her tone sharpened, and Cole flickered his eyes towards them. No, Selina said hurriedly. I don't believe in keeping slaves. Something twisted in her gut at the thought of all those slaves she'd left behind in Enver. All those people doomed to suffer until they die. Just because she left Endeavour didn't mean Endeavour had ceased to be. Nehemia's voice was soft. Then you are very unlike your court companions. Selina could only manage a nod to the princess as they turned their attention to the hall ahead. Servants darted past, eyes wide as they beheld the princess and her guards. After a moment of silence, Selina squared her shoulders. Why are you in Rifthold, if I might ask? She added. Your Highness? You don't need to bother calling me that. The princess toyed with one of the gold bangles around her wrist. I came at the request of my father, the king of Eloy, to learn your language and customs so I might better serve Eloy and my people. Given what she'd heard of Nehemia, Selina didn't think that was entirety of it, but she smiled politely as she said, How long will you remain in Rifthold? Until my father sends for me again. She stopped playing with the bracelets as she frowned at the rain pounding the windows. If I'm fortunate, I'd only be here until spring, unless my father decides that a man from Mount Island might make me a good consort. And then I'll be here until the matter is settled. Seeing the annoyance in the princess's eyes, Selina felt a shred of pity for whatever man her father chose. A thought struck at her, and Selina tilted her head to the side. Whom would you marry? Prince Dorian? It was prying and a bit of and a bit impertinent, and she regretted the question the second it came out. But Nehemia just clicked her tongue. That pretty boy? He grinned at me far too much. And you should only see how he winked at the other women in the court. I want a husband to warm my bed, and my bed alone. She glanced sidelong at the assassin, giving her another head-to-toe examination. Selena caught the princess's eyes lingering on the few scars on her hands. Where are you from, Lillian? Selena casually hid her hands in the folds of her gown. Belhaven, a city in Fenharrow. It's a fishing port. Smells terrible. That wasn't a lie. Every time she visited Belhaven for a mission, the reek of fish made her gag if she got too near the docks. The princess chuckled. Rifthold smells terrible. Too many people. At least in Benjali, the sun burns up everything, and my father's river palace smells like lotus blossoms. Cole cleared his throat beside them, obviously tired of being excluded from the conversation, and Selena grinned at him. Don't be so glum, she said in the common tongue. We must cater to the princess. Stop your gloating, he said, his brows low. He put a hand on the hilt of his sword, and Nehemia's guard stepped closer to him. Though Cole may be the captain of the guard, Selena didn't doubt for a moment that Nehemia's guards would put him down if he became a threat. We're only bringing her around to the King's Council. I'm going to have a word with them about allowing Caitlin to show her around. Do you hunt? Nehemia interrupted in Ilwe. Me? The princess nodded. Oh, no, Selena said, then switched back to Ilwe. I'm more of a reader. Nehemia looked towards a rain-splattered window. Most of our books were burned 5 years ago, when Adalin marched in. Didn't make a difference if the books were about magic. Her voice quieted at the word, even though Cole and the councilman didn't understand them. Or history. They just burned the libraries whole, along with the museums and universities. A familiar ache filled her chest. Selena nodded. Ilwe wasn't the only country where that happened. Something cold and bitter glittered in Nehemia's eyes. Now it's the books we receive are from Ardalin, books in a language I can barely understand. That's also what I must learn while I'm here. There are so many things. She stomped her foot, her jewelry clinking. And I hate these shoes. And this miserable dress. I don't care if it's Ilwe silk. And I'm supposed to be representing my kingdom. The material's been itching me ever since I put it on. She stared at Selena's elegant, elaborate gown. How can you stand wearing that enormous thing? Selena picked at the skirts of her dress. It breaks my ribs, to be honest. Well, at least I'm not the only one suffering, Nehemia said. Cole stopped before a door and informed the 6 sentries posted outside to watch the woman and the princess's guards. What's he doing? Returning you to the council and ensuring that Caitlin doesn't lead you around again? Nehemia's shoulders slumped slightly. I've only been here for a day, and I wish to leave. She let out a long sigh through her nose, and again turned to the window, as if she could see all the way back to Ilwe. Suddenly, she grabbed Selena's hand and squeezed it. Her fingers were slightly, surprisingly, calloused, in all the spots where the hilt of a sword or dagger might rest. Selena's eyes met with those of the princess, and she dropped her hand. Perhaps the rumors were correct about association with the rebels in Ilwe. Will you keep me company while I'm here, Lady Lillian? Selena blinked at the request, feeling, despite herself, honored. Of course, when I'm available, I'll gladly attend to you. I have attendants. I wish for someone to talk to. Selena couldn't help it. She beamed. Cole entered into the hallway once more and bowed to the princess. The council would like to see you, Selena translated. Nehemia let out a low groan, but thanked Cole before turning to Selena. I'm glad we met, Lady Lillian, Nehemia said, her eyes bright. Peace be with you. And with you, the assassin muttered, watching her leave. She never had many friends, and the ones she had often disappointed her. Sometimes with devastating consequences, as she learned that summer with the silent assassins of the Red Desert. After that, she'd sworn never to trust girls again, especially girls with agendas and power of their own, who would do anything to get what they wanted. But as the door closed behind the ivory train of the Ilwe princess, Selena wondered if she'd been wrong. Cole Westfall watched the assassin eat lunch, her eyes darting from one plate to the next. She had immediately stripped from a gown upon entering her rooms, and now sat in a rose and jade dressing robe that suited her well. "You're awfully quiet today," she said, her mouth full of food, which she never stopped eating. She ate more than anyone he knew, including his guards. She had multiple helpings of every course at every meal. "Enthralled by the Princess Nehemia?" The words were barely distinguishable from her chewing. "That headstrong girl?" He immediately regretted the remark as her eyes narrowed. A lecture was coming on, and he was in no mood to be patronized. He had more important things on his mind. Before departing this morning, the king hadn't taken any of the guards he'd suggested he bring on his journey, and refused to say where he was going, or to accept his offer of accompaniment. Not to mention the fact that a few of the royal hounds had gone missing, only to have their half-eaten remains found in the north wing of the palace. That was worrisome. Who would do such a gruesome thing? "And what's wrong with headstrong girls?" she pressed. "Other than the fact that they're not wooden-headed ninnies who can only open their mouths to give gossip or orders." "I just prefer a certain type of woman." Thankfully, it was the right thing to say, because she batted her eyelashes. "And what type of woman is that?" "Not an arrogant assassin." She pouted. "Suppose I wasn't an assassin. Would you fancy me then?" "No." "Would you prefer Lady Caitlin?" "Don't be a fool." It was easy to be mean, but it wasn't. It was also getting far too easy to be nice. He took a bite of bread. She watched him, her head angled. He sometimes felt that she looked at him the way a cat regards a mouse. He just wondered how long it would take for her to pounce. She shrugged and took a bite from an apple. There was something girlish about her, too. Oh, he couldn't stand her contradictions. "You're staring, Captain." He almost apologized, but stopped. She was a haughty, vulgar, utterly impertinent assassin. He wished for the months to fly by, for her to be appointed champion, and then, once her years of servitude were over, to be gone. He hadn't slept well since they'd taken her out of Endeavour. "You have food in your teeth," he said. She picked it out with a sharp nail and turned her head to the window. The rain slid down the glass. Was she looking at the rain, or something beyond? He sipped from his goblet. Despite her arrogance, she was clever, and relatively kind and somewhat charming. But where was that writhing darkness? Why didn't it show itself so he could just throw her into the dungeon and call off this ridiculous competition? Was there something great and deadly concealed within her, and he didn't like it? He'd be ready. When the time came, he'd be ready. He just wondered which one of them would survive. Chapter 14. For the next 4 days, Selena awoke before dawn to train in her room, using whatever she could to exercise. Chairs, the doorway, even a billiards table and cue sticks. The ball was made for remarkable balance tours. Around dawn, Cole usually showed up for breakfast. Afterward, they ran through the game park, where he kept a pace set aside. Autumn had fully come, and the wind smelled of crisp leaves and snow. Cole never said anything when she doubled over, hands on her knees, and vomited up her breakfast. Nor did he comment on the fact that she would go further and farther each day without stopping for breath. Once they'd finished their run, they trained in a private room far from a competitor's eyes, until, that is, she collapsed to the ground and cried that she was about to die of hunger and fatigue. At lessons, the knives remained Selena's favorites, but the wooden staff became dear. Naturally, it had to do with the fact that she could freely whack him and not chop off an arm. Since her initial meeting with Princess Nehemia, she hadn't seen or heard from the princess, not even chatter from the servants. Cole always came for lunch, and afterwards she joined the other champions for a few more hours of training under Brulow's watchful eye. Most of the training was just to make sure they could actually use weapons. And, of course, she kept her head down throughout it all, doing enough to keep Brulo from critiquing her, but not enough to make him praise her the way he did Cain. Cain. How she loathed him. Brulo practically worshipped the man, and even the other champions nodded their respect whenever he passed. No one bothered to comment on how perfect her form was. Was this how the other assassins of the Assassin's Keep had felt, all those years she'd been hogging Arabin Hamel's attention? But there, it was hard to focus when Cain was nearby, taunting and sneering, waiting for her to make one mistake. Hopefully, he didn't distract her on the first elimination test. Brulo hadn't given them any hints at what they might be tested for, and Cole was just as clueless. The day before the first test, she knew something was wrong long before she got to the training hall. Cole hadn't shown up for breakfast, but rather sent her guards to bring her to the training hall to practice on her own. He didn't show up for lunch either, and by the time she was escorted to the hall, she was brimming with questions. Without Cole to stand near, she lingered beside a pillar, watching the competitors file in, flanked by guards and their trainers. Brulo wasn't there yet. Another oddity, and there were far too many guards in the training hall today. What do you suppose this is about? Noxoan, the young thief from Perinath, asked from beside her. After proving himself somewhat skilled during practice, many of the other competitors had sought him out, but he still opted to keep to himself. Captain Westfall didn't train me this morning, she offered. What was the harm in admitting that? Nox held out his hand. Noxoan. I know who you are, she said, but shook his hand anyway. His grip was solid, his hand calloused and scarred. He'd seen his fair share of action. Good. I felt a bit invisible with that hulking lout showing off these past few days. He jerked his chin towards Kane, who was in the middle of examining his bulging biceps. A large ring of black, iridescent stone glimmered on Kane's finger. Strange that he'd wear it to practice. Nox went on. Did you see Varen? He looks like he's going to be sick. He pointed to the loudmouth thief that Selena wanted to knock out cold. Normally, Varen could be found near Kane, taunting the other champions, but today he stood alone by the window, face pale and eyes wide. I heard him talking to Kane, said a timid voice behind them, and they found Pella, the youngest assassin, standing nearby. She spent half a day watching Pella, and while she only pretended to be a mediocre, he truly could use the training. Assassin indeed. His voice hasn't even deepened yet. How did he wind up here? What did he say? Nox put his hands in his pockets. His clothes weren't as ratty as the other competitors. The mere fact that she'd actually heard his name implied that he must have been a good thief in Perinath. Pella's freckled face paled a bit. Bill Chastain, the Eye-Eater, was found stone cold dead this morning. A champion was dead. And a notorious killer at that. How? She demanded. Pella swallowed hard. Varen said it wasn't pretty. Like someone ripped him wide open. He passed the body on his way here. Nox cursed under his breath, and Selena studied the other champions. A hush had fallen on the group, and clusters of them stood together, whispering. Varen's story was spreading fast. Pella went on. He said Chastain's body was in ribbons. A chill snaked down her spine, but she shook her head, just as a guard entered and told them that Brulo had ordered them to have free reign of the training hall today, and to practice what they wanted. Needing to distract herself from the image forming in her mind, she didn't bother to say goodbye to Nox and Pella, and she strode to the weapons rack and gathered a belt strapped with throwing knives. She took her place near the archery targets. Nox joined her a minute later, and started firing his knives at the target. He hit the second ring, but never got any closer to the center. His skill with knives wasn't nearly as good as his archery. She drew a dagger from the belt. Who would have killed one of the champions so brutally? And how had they gotten away with it, if the body was in the hall? This castle was swarming with guards. A champion was dead, and just the day before the first test. Would this start a pattern? Her focus narrowed to the small black dot in the center of the target. She steadied her breathing as she cocked her arm, letting her wrist go loose. The sounds of the other champions faded. The blackness of the bullseyes beckoned. And as she exhaled, she sent the dagger flying. It sparkled, a shooting star of steel. She smiled grimly as it struck home. Beside her, Nox swore colorfully when his dagger hit the third ring on his target, and her smile broadened, despite the shredded corpse that lay somewhere in the castle. Selena drew another dagger, but paused as Varen called to her from the ring where he sparred with Kane. Circus tricks ain't much use when you're the king's champion. She shifted her gaze to him, but kept positioned towards the target. You'd be better off on your back, learning tricks useful to a woman. In fact, I can teach you some tonight, if you like. He laughed, and Kane joined with him. Selena gripped the hilt of the dagger so hard that it hurt. Don't listen to them, Nox murmured. He tossed another dagger, missing the bullseye again. They wouldn't know the first thing to do with a woman. even if one walked stark naked into their bedroom. Selena drew her dagger, and the blade clanged as it landed a hair's width from the one she'd already embedded in the bullseye. Knox's dark brows rose, accentuating his grey eyes. He couldn't have been older than 25. You've got impressive aim. For a girl? She challenged. No, he said, and threw another dagger. For anyone. The dagger yet again missed the mark. He stalked to the target, yanking out all 6 daggers and shoving them in their sheaths before returning to the throwing line. Selena cleared her throat. You're standing wrong, she said, quietly enough so the other champions couldn't hear. And you're holding your wrist incorrectly. Knox lowered his arm. She took up a stance. Legs like this, she said. He studied her for a moment, then positioned his legs similarly. Bend slightly at the knees, shoulders back. Loosen your wrists. Throw when you exhale. She demonstrated for him, and her dagger found its mark. Show me again, Knox said appreciatively. She did so and struck the target. Then she threw with her left hand and fought her whoop of triumph as the blade sank into the handle of another dagger. Knox focused on the target as he brought up his arm. Well, you've just put me to shame, he said, laughing under his breath as he lifted his dagger higher. Keep your wrist even looser, was her only reply. It's all about how you snap it. Knox obeyed, and he exhaled a long breath. His dagger flew. It didn't hit the bullseye, but it came within the inner circle. His brows rose. That's a bit of an improvement. Just a bit, she said, and held her ground as he gathered their knives from the 2 targets and handed hers back. She sheathed them in a belt. You're from Perinth, right? She asked, though she'd never been to Perinth, Terrason's second largest city. The mention of her homeland still spiked a bolt of fear and guilt. It had been 10 years since the royal family had been butchered. 10 years since the King of Ardalen had marched his army in. 10 years since Terrason met its doom with bowed heads and silence. She shouldn't have mentioned it. She didn't know why she mentioned it, actually. She scored her features into a polite interest as Knox nodded. This is my first time out of Perinth, actually. You said you were from Bowhaven, weren't you? My father is a merchant, she lied. And what does he think about a daughter who steals jewels for a living? She conceded a smile and hurled a knife into the target. You won't be inviting me home for a while, that's for certain. You're in good hands, though. You've got the best trainer out of anyone. I've seen you 2 running at dawn. I have to beg mine to put down the bottle and let me train outside for lessons. He inclined his head towards his trainer, who sat against the wall, the hood of his cape over his eyes. Sleeping. Yet again. The captain of the guard is a pain in my ass, at times, she said, chucking another knife. But you're right. He's the best. Knox was quiet for a moment before he said, The next time we pair off for lessons, find me, will you? Why? She reached for another dagger, but found she'd depleted her stock again. Knox threw another dagger and hit it at the bullseye this time. Because my gold's on you winning this whole damn thing. She smiled a little. Let's hope you won't be eliminated at the test tomorrow. She scanned the training hall for any sign of the challenge to come the following morning, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The other competitors remained mostly quiet, save for Kane and Varen, and many of them were pale as snow. Let's just hope neither of us wind up like the Aita, she added, and meant it. Don't you ever do anything other than read? Said Cole. She started from a chair on the balcony, and he took a seat beside her. The late afternoon sunlight warmed her face, and the last balmy breeze of autumn rushed through her unbound hair. She stuck out her tongue. Shouldn't you be looking for the Aita's murder? He never came to her rooms after lunch. Something dark flitted across his eyes. That's none of your business, and don't try to pry details from me about it, he added as she opened her mouth. He pointed to the book in her lap. I saw at lunch you're reading The Wind and the Rain, and I forgot to ask you what you thought. He'd really come to talk about a book when a champion's corpse had been found that morning. It's a bit dense, she admitted, holding up the brown volume in her lap. When he didn't reply, she asked, Why are you really here? I had a long day. She massaged an ache in her knees. Because of Bill's murder? Because the prince dragged me into a council meeting that lasted for 3 hours, he said, a muscle in his jaw feathering. I thought His Royal Highness was your friend. He is. How long have you been friends? He paused, and she knew he was contemplating how she might use the information against him, weighing the risk of telling her the truth. She was about to snap at him when he said, Since we were young, we were the only boys of our age in the castle. At least, of high rank. We had lessons together, played together, trained together. But when I was 13, my father moved my family back to our home in Anile. The city on the Silver Lake. It somehow made sense that Cole's family ruled Anile. The citizens of Anile were warriors from birth and had been guardians against the hordes of the wild men from the White Fang Mountains for generations. Thankfully, things had gotten a little easier for the warriors of Anile in the past 10 years. The White Fang Mountain Men had been one of the first peoples to be put down by Adalin's conquering armies, and very rarely did their rebels make it to slavery. She'd heard tales of the mountain men killing their wives and their children, then themselves, rather than be taken by Adalin. The thought of Cole going up against hundreds of them, against men built like Cain, made her a little sick. Yes, Cole said, fiddling with a long hunting knife at his side. I was slotted to join the royal council like my father. He wanted me to spend some time among my own people and learn whatever it is councilmen learned. He said that with the king's army now in the mountains, we could move our interests from fighting, the mountain, folk to politics. His golden eyes were distant. But I missed, Riff told. So you ran away? She marveled that he was volunteering this much. Hadn't he refused to tell her almost anything about himself while traveling from Endeavour? Run away? Cole chuckled. No, Dorian convinced the captain of the guard to take me as his apprentice, with the help of Brullo. My father refused, so I abdicated my title as Lord of Anile to my brother and left the next day. The captain's silence suggested that he could not say, that his father hadn't objected. What of his mother? He loosed a long breath. What about you, then? She crossed her arms. I thought you didn't want to know anything about me. There was a ghost of a smile on his face as he watched the sky melt into a smear of tangerine. What do your parents make of their daughter being Adalin's assassin? My parents are dead, she said. They died when I was 8. So you... Her heart thundered in her chest. I was born in Terrason, then I became an assassin, then I went to Endeavour and now I'm here, and that's it. Silence fell. Then he asked, Where'd you get that scar on your right hand? She didn't need to glance at the jagged line that ran along the top of her hand, just above her wrist. She flexed her fingers. When I was 12, Arabin Hamill decided I wasn't nearly as skilled at swordplay with my left hand, so he gave me a choice. Either he could break my right hand, or I could do it myself. The phantom memory of the blinding pain lanced through her hand. That night I put my hand against the doorframe and slammed the door shut on it. I split my hand wide open and broke 2 bones. It took months to heal, months during which I could only use my left hand. She gave him a vicious smile. I bet Brullo never did that to you. No, he said quietly. No, he didn't. He cleared his throat and stood. The first test is tomorrow. Are you ready? Of course, she lied. He remained, standing there for a moment longer, studying her. I'll see you tomorrow morning, he said, and left. In the silence that followed in his wake, she contemplated his story, the paths that had made them so different, but so similar. She wrapped her arms around herself, a cold wind picking up the skirts of her dress and blowing them behind her. Chapter 15. Though she'd never admit it, Selena didn't really know what to expect at their first test. With all the training over the past 5 days and fiddling with various weapons and techniques, her body ached, which was another thing she'd never admit, even though hiding the throbbing pain in her limbs was nearly impossible. As Selena and Cole entered the giant sparring room in the morning, she glanced at her competitors and remembered she wasn't the only one who hadn't a clue what to expect. A towering black curtain had been swept across half of the room, blocking the other half from sight. Whatever lay beyond that curtain, she realized, was to decide the fate of one of them. The normal ruckus that had been replaced by rustling quiet, and rather than mill about, the competitors lingered by their trainers' sides. She kept close to Cole, which wasn't a change from the ordinary, but the sponsors atop the mezzanine, looking over the black and white checkered floor, were. Her throat tightened as her gaze met with that of the Crown Prince. Aside from sending her his books, she hadn't seen or heard from him since the meeting with the king. He flashed her a grin, those sapphire eyes gleaming in the morning light. She offered him a tight smile in return, and quickly looked away. Brulot stood by the curtain, a scarred hand upon his sword, and Selina studied the scene. Someone stepped to her side, and she knew who it was before he spoke. It's a bit dramatic, don't you think? She glanced sidelong at Knox. Cole tensed next to her, and she could feel him watching the thief closely, no doubt wondering if she and Knox were formulating some escape plan that would include the deaths of every member of the royal family. After 5 days of mindless training, she replied quietly, all too aware that very few people were speaking in the hall. I'm glad for a bit of excitement. Knox laughed under his breath. What do you think it is? She shrugged, keeping her attention on the curtain. More and more competitors were arriving, and soon the clock would strike 9, the time when the test would begin. Even if she knew what was behind the curtain, she certainly wouldn't help him. Hopefully it's a pack of man-eating wolves that we have to take on with our bare hands. She looked at him, full, now, a half-smile on her lips. Wouldn't that be fun? Cole suddenly cleared his throat. Now was not the time for talking. She stuffed her hands into the pockets of her black pants. Best of luck, she said to Knox before she strode towards the curtain, Cole following her. When they were far enough away, she asked under her breath, No idea what's behind that curtain? Cole shook his head. She adjusted the thick leather belt slung low across her hips. It was the kind of belt intended to bear the weight of multiple weapons. Its lightness now reminded her of what she'd lost, and what she had to gain. The death of the Aita yesterday had been fortunate in one aspect, one less man to compete with. She glanced up at Dorian. He could probably see what was behind the curtain from his place in the mezzanine. Why not help her cheat a little? She flicked her attention to the other sponsors. Noblemen in fine clothing and ground her teeth at the sight of Parrington. He smirked as he watched Kane, who was stretching out his muscular arms. Had he already told Kane what was behind the curtain? Brulot cleared his throat. Attention now, he called to them. All other competitors tried to look calm as he strode to the center of the curtain. Your first test has arrived. He grinned broadly, as if whatever the curtain concealed was going to torment the hell out of them. As His Majesty had ordered, one of you will be eliminated today. One of you will be deemed unworthy. Just get on with it, she thought, her jaw clenched tight. As if he'd read her thoughts, Brulot snapped his fingers, and a guard standing by the wall pulled the curtain back. Inch by inch it swayed away until Selina bit down a laugh. Archery. It was an archery contest. Rules are simple, Brulot said. Behind him, 5 targets were staggered at various distances through the hall. You get 5 shots, 1 per target. The one with the worst aim goes home. Some of the competitors began murmuring, but it was all she could do to keep from beaming. Unfortunately, Kane didn't bother to hide his triumphant grin. Why couldn't he have been the champion who was found dead? You go one at a time, Brulot said, and behind them a pair of soldiers rolled out a cart of bows and quivers loaded with arrows. Form a line at the table and to determine your order. The test begins now. She expected them to rush to the long table stacked with identical bows and arrows, but apparently none of the 21 other competitors were in much of a hurry to go home. Selina made to join the forming line, but Cole grasped her shoulder. Don't show off, he warned. She smiled sweetly and pried his fingers off her. I try not to. She purred and joined the line. It was an enormous leap of faith to give them arrows, even if the tips were blunted. A dull head wouldn't stop it from going through Parrington's throat, or Dorian's, if she wanted. Though the thought was entertaining, she kept her attention on the competitors. With 22 champions and 5 shots each, the test took a dreadfully long time. Thanks to Cole pulling her aside, she'd been in the back of the line. Not dead last, but 3 from the end. Far enough back that she'd had to watch everyone else go before her, including Kane. The other competitors did well enough. The giant circular targets were composed of 5 colored rings, yellow marking the center with only a tiny black dot to mark the bullseye. Each target got smaller the further back it was placed, and because the room was so long, the final target was nearly 70 yards away. Selena ran her fingers along the smooth curve of a yew bow. Archery was one of the first skills Arabin had taught her, a staple of any assassin's training. Two of the assassins further proved it with easy, skilled shots. Though they didn't hit the bullseyes and the shots got sloppier the further the target, whoever their masters had been, they'd known what they were teaching. Pella, the gangly assassin, wasn't yet strong enough to manage a longbow and barely made any shots. When he finished, his eyes gleamed with resentment. The champion sniggered and the cane laughed the loudest. Brulo's face was grim. Didn't anyone ever teach you how to use a bow, boy? Pella lifted his face, glaring at the weapons master with a surprising brazenness. I'm more skilled in poisons. Poisons? Brulo threw up his hands. The king wants a champion, and you couldn't shoot a cow in a pasture. The weapons master waved Pella off. The other champions laughed again, and Selena wanted nothing more than to smile with them. But Pella took shuddering breaths, his shoulders relaxing, and joined the other finished competitors. If he wound up being eliminated, where would they bring him? To prison? Or some other hellhole? Despite herself, Selena felt bad for the boy. His shots hadn't been that bad. It was Knox, actually, who surprised her the most, with 3 bullseyes into the nearer targets, and 2 final shots along the border of the inner ring. Perhaps she could consider him for an ally. From the way the other competitors watched him as he strode to the back of the room, she knew they were thinking the same thing. Grave, the repulsive assassin, did fine, she supposed. 4 bullseyes, and the final shot right on the border of the innermost ring. But then Kane stepped up to the white line painted at the back of the room, drew back his yew bow, his black ring glinting, and fired. Again and again and again, within the span of a few seconds. And then when the sound of his final shot stopped echoing in the silent chamber, Selena's stomach turned over. 5 bullseyes. Her one consolation was that none of them had been on the black dot, the absolute center. One had come close, though. For some reason, the line started moving quickly. All she could think about was Kane. Kane getting applauded by Parrington. Kane getting clapped on the back by Brulo. Kane getting all of that praise and attention not because he was a mountain of muscle, but because he actually deserved it. Suddenly, Selena found herself standing on the white line, looking at the vast length of the room before her. Some of the men chuckled, albeit quietly, and she kept her head high as she reached over her shoulder for an arrow and knocked it onto her bow. They'd done some archery practice a few days earlier, and she'd been excellent, or as excellent as she could be without attracting attention. And she'd killed men from longer shots than the farthest targets. Clean shots, too, right through the throat. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. I am Selena Sardathine, Adalin's assassin. If these men knew who I was, they'd stop laughing. I am Selena Sardathine. I'm going to win. I will not be afraid. She pulled back her bow, the sore muscles in her arm aching with the effort. She shut out noise, shut out movement, shut out anything other than the sound of her breathing as her focus narrowed on the first target. She took a steady breath as she exhaled. She let the arrow fly. Bullseye. The tightness in her stomach abated and she sighed through her nose. It wasn't an absolute bullseye, but she hadn't been aiming for it anyway. Some men stopped laughing, but she paid them no heed as she knocked another arrow and fired at the second target. She aimed for the edge of the innermost ring, which she hit with deadly precision. She could have made an entire circle of arrows if she wanted, and if she had enough ammunition. She got another bullseye on the third target, aiming for the edge, but landing within the border. She did the same for the fourth target, but aimed for the opposite side of the bullseye. Where she aimed, the arrow made its mark. As she reached for her last arrow, she heard one of the competitors, a red-haired mercenary named Renaud, snigger. She clenched her bow tightly enough for the wood to groan, and she pulled back her final shot. The target was little more than a blur of color, so far back that its bullseye was a grain of sand in the vastness of the room. She couldn't see the little dot in the center, the dot that no one had yet to touch, even Kane. Selena's arm trembled with effort as she pulled the string back a bit further and fired. The arrow hit the absolute center, obliterating the black dots. They stopped laughing. No one said anything to her when she stalked away from the line and tossed her bow back into the cart. Cole only scowled at her. Obviously, she hadn't been that inconspicuous, but Dorian smiled. She sighed and joined the competitors waiting for the competition to finish, keeping well away from them. When the marks were compared by Brullo himself, one of the army soldiers, not young Pella, wound up being eliminated. But though she hadn't lost by any means, Selena absolutely could not stand, the feeling that she hadn't really won anything at all. Chapter 16. Despite her attempt to keep her breathing steady, Selena gasped for air as she ran beside Cole in the game park. If he was winded, he didn't show it, other than the gleam of sweat on his face and the dampness of his white shirt. They ran towards a hill, its top still shrouded in morning mist. Her legs buckled at the sight of the incline, and her stomach rose in her throat. Selena let out a loud gasp to get Cole's attention before she slowed to a stop and braced her hands against a tree trunk. She took a shuddering breath, holding on tightly to the tree as she vomited. She hated the warmth of the tears that leaked from her eyes, but couldn't wipe them away as she heaved again, gagging. Cole stood nearby just watching. She leaned her brow into her upper arm, calming her breathing, willing her body to ease. It had been 3 days since the first test, 10 since her arrival in Rifthold, and she was still horribly out of shape. The next elimination was in 4 days, and though training had resumed as usual, she had started waking up a little earlier than normal. She would not lose to Kane or Reynolds or any of them. Done? Cole asked. She lifted her head to give him a withering glare, but everything spun, dragging her down with it, and she retched again. I told you not to eat before we left. Are you done being smug? Are you done vomiting up your guts? For the time being, she snapped. Perhaps I won't be so courteous next time, and I'll just vomit all over you instead. If you can catch me, he said with a half smile. She wanted to punch the smirk off his face, but as she took a step, her knees shook. She put her hands against the tree again, waiting for the wretch to renew. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him looking at her back, most of which was exposed by her damp white undershirt. She stood. Are you enjoying looking at my scars? He sucked on his lower lip for a moment. When did you get those? She knew he meant 3 enormous lines that ran down her back. When do you think? She said. He didn't reply, and she looked at the canopy of leaves above them. A morning breeze sent them all shuddering, ripping a few from where they clung to the skeletal branches. Those 3 I received, my first day in Endeavour. What did you do to deserve it? Deserve it? She laughed sharply. No one deserves to be whipped like an animal. He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. I arrived in Endeavour, and they dragged me into the centre of the camp and tied me between the whipping posts. 21 lashes. She stared at him, without entirely seeing him, as the ash-grey sky turned into the bleakness of Endeavour, and the hiss of the wind became the sighing of slaves. That was before I had befriended any of the other slaves, and I spent that first night wondering if I'd ever make it to the morning. If my back would become infected, or if I would bleed out and die before I knew what was happening. No one helped you? Only in the morning. A young woman slipped me a tin of salve before we were waiting in line for breakfast. I never got to thank her. Later that day, 4 overseers raped and killed her. She clenched her hands into fists as her eyes stung. The day I snapped, I stopped by their section of the mines to repay them for what they did to her. Something frozen rushed through her veins. They died too quickly. But you were a woman in Endeavour, Cole said, his voice rough and quiet. No one ever. He trailed off, unable to form the words. She gave him a slow, bitter smile. They were afraid of me to begin with, and after that day I almost touched the wall. None of them dared to come too close to me. But if one guard tried to get too friendly, well, he'd become the example that reminded the others I could easily snap again, if I felt like it. The wind stirred around them, ripping strands of hair from her braid. She didn't need to voice her other suspicion, that perhaps somehow Arabin had bribed the guards in Endeavour for her safety. We each survive in our own way. Selena didn't quite understand the softness in the look he gave her as he nodded. She only stared at him for a moment longer before she burst into a run, up towards the hill, where the first rays of sunshine began to peek through. The following afternoon, the champions stood gathered around Brulo, who lectured them on different weapons and other nonsense she'd learned years ago, and didn't need to hear again. She was just contemplating whether she could sleep while standing up. From the corner of her eye, a sudden movement on the balcony doors caught her attention. Selena turned just in time to see one of the larger champions, one of the discharged soldiers, shove a nearby guard and knock him to the ground. The guard's head hit the marble with a crack, and he was instantly unconscious. She didn't dare to move. None of the champions did, as the man hurtled towards the door, towards the gardens and escape. But Cole and his men moved so fast that the fleeing champion didn't have much time to touch the glass doors before an arrow went clean through his throat. Silence fell, and half of the guards encircled the champions, hands in their swords, while the others, Cole included, rushed to the dead champion and fallen guard. Bows groaned as the archers in the mezzanine pulled their strings taut. Selena kept still, as did Knox, who was standing close beside her. One wrong movement in a spooked guard could kill her. Even Cain didn't breathe too deeply. Through the wall of champions, guards, and their weapons, Selena beheld Cole kneeling by the unconscious guard. No one touched the fallen champion who lay face down, his hand still outstretched towards the glass door. Sven had been his name, though she didn't know why he'd been expelled from the army. Gods above! Knox breathed so softly that his lips barely moved. They just killed him. She thought about telling him to shut up, but even snapping at him seemed risky. Some of the other champions were murmuring to each other, but no one dared to take a step. I knew they were serious about not letting us leave, but Knox swore, and she felt him glance sidelong at her. I was granted immunity by my sponsor. He tracked me down and said I wouldn't go to prison if I lost the competition. At that point, she knew he was speaking more to himself, and when she didn't respond, Knox stopped talking. She stared and stared at the dead champion. What had made Sven risk it? And why here, right now? There were still 3 days until the second test. What had made this moment so special? The day she snapped at Endeavour, she hadn't been thinking about freedom. No, she'd picked the time and place and started swinging. She'd never meant to escape. The sunlight shone through the doors, illuminating the champion's splattered blood like stained glass. Maybe he'd realized that he had no chance of winning, and that this kind of death was far better than returning to whatever place he'd come from. If he wanted to escape, he would have waited until dark, when he was away from everyone in the competition. Sven had wanted to prove a point. She understood, and understood only because the day she had come within a fingertip of touching the wall at Endeavour. Adalin could take their freedom. It could destroy their lives and beat break and whip them. It could force them into ridiculous contests. But criminal or not, they were still human. Dying, rather than playing in the king's game, was the only choice left to him. Still staring at his outstretched hand, forever pointed towards an unreachable horizon, Selena said a silent prayer for the dead champion and wished him well. Chapter 17. With heavy eyelids, Dorian Le Villiard tried not to slouch as he sat upon his throne. Music and chatter flitted through the air, wooing him to sleep. Why must his mother insist on his attending court? Even the weekly afternoon visit was too much. But it was better than studying the corpse of the eye-eater, which Cole had spent the past few days investigating. He'd worry about that later, if it became an issue, which it wouldn't if Cole was looking into it. It had probably just been a drunken brawl. And then there was the champion who tried to escape this afternoon. Dorian shuddered at the thought of what it must have been like to witness it, and at the mess Cole had to deal with, from the injured soldier to the sponsor who lost his champion to the dead man himself. What had his father been thinking when he decided to host this contest? Dorian glanced at his mother, seated on a throne beside his own. She certainly didn't know anything about it, and probably would have been horrified if she knew what kind of criminals were living under her roof. His mother was still beautiful, though her face was a bit wrinkled and cracked with powder, and her auburn hair had a few silver streaks. Today she was swathed in yards of forest green velvet, and floating scarves and shawls of gold, and a crown upheld a sparkling veil that gave Dorian the distinct impression she was wearing a tent upon her head. Before them, the nobility strutted across the floor of the court, gossiping, scheming, seducing. An orchestra played minutes in a corner, and servants slipped through the gathered nobles in a dance of their own, as they refilled and cleared plates and cups and silverware. Dorian felt like an ornament. Of course, he was wearing an outfit of his mother's choosing, sent to him this morning, a vest of dark bluish green velvet, with almost ridiculously billowy white sleeves, bursting from the blue and white striped shoulders. The pants, mercifully, were light grey, though his chestnut suede boots looked too new for masculine pride. "Dorian, my dear, you're sulking." He gave Queen Georgina an apologetic grin. "I received a letter from Holland. He sends his love." "Did he say anything of interest?" "Only that he loathes school and wishes to come home. He says that, every letter." The Queen of Adalin sighed. "If your father didn't prevent me, I'd have him home." "He's better off at school." When it came to Holland, the farthest away he was, the better. Georgina surveyed her son. "You were better behaved. You never disobeyed your tutors. Oh, my poor Holland. When am I dead? You'll care for him, won't you?" "Dead? Mother? You're only— I know how old I am." She waved a ring across her hand. "Which is why you must marry. And soon." "Marry?" Dorian ground his teeth. "Marry whom?" "Dorian, you are the crown prince, and already 19 at that. Do you wish to become a king and die without an heir so Holland can take the throne?" He didn't answer. "I thought so." After a moment, she said, "There are plenty of young women who might make a good wife, though a princess would be preferred." "There are no princesses left," he said a bit sharply. "Except for Princess Nehemia." She laughed and put a hand on his. "Oh, don't worry, I won't force you to marry her. I'm surprised your father allows her to still bear the title, the impetuous, haughty girl. Do you know she refused to wear the dress I sent her?" "I'm sure the princess has her reasons," Dorian said warily, disgusted by his mother's unspoken prejudice. "I've only spoken to her once, but she seemed lively." "Then perhaps you shall marry her." His mother laughed again before he could respond. Dorian smiled weakly. He still couldn't figure out why his father had granted the King of Eloy's request that his daughter visit their court to become better acquainted with the ways of Adalin. As far as ambassadors went, Nehemia wasn't exactly the best choice. Not when he'd heard rumors of her support of the Eloy rebels and her efforts to shut down the labor camp at Calicula. Dorian couldn't blame her for that, though not after he'd seen the horror that was Endeavour and the destruction it had wrought upon Selena Sadathine's body. But his father never did anything without a reason, and from the few words he'd exchanged with Nehemia, he couldn't help but wonder if she had her own motivations in coming here too. "It's a pity that Lady Caitlin has an agreement with Duke Parrington," his mother went on. "She's such a beautiful girl, and so polite. Perhaps she has a sister." Dorian crossed his arms, swallowing his repulsion. Caitlin stood at the far end of the court, and he was all too aware of her eyes creeping over every inch of him. He shifted in his seat, his tailbone aching from sitting too long. "What about Elise?" the Queen said, indicating a young blonde lady clad in lavender. "She's very beautiful, and can be quite playful, as I've already learned." "Elise bores me," he said. "Oh, Dorian," she put a hand over her heart. "You're not about to inform me that you wish to marry for love, are you? Love does not guarantee a successful marriage." He was bored. Bored of these women, bored of these cavaliers who masqueraded as companions, bored of everything. He hoped his journey to Enderville would quell that boredom, and that he'd be glad to return home, but he found home to be the same ladies still looking at him with pleading eyes, the same serving girls still winking at him, the same councilmen still slipping pieces of potential legislation under his door with hopeful notes. And his father would always be preoccupied with conquest, and wouldn't stop until every continent bore Ardalin's flag. Even gambling over the so-called champions had become achingly dull. It was clear Kane and Selena would ultimately face each other, and until then, with the other champions, went worth his time. "You're sulking again. Are you upset over something, my pet? Have you heard from Rosamond? My poor child. How she broke your heart?" The Queen shook her head. "Though it was over a year ago." He didn't reply. He didn't want to think about Rosamond, or about the boorish husband she'd left him for. Some nobles started dancing, weaving in and out of each other. Many were his age, but he somehow felt as if they existed in a vast distance between them. He didn't feel older, nor did he feel any wiser, but rather he felt, he felt as if there was something inside him that didn't fit with their merriment, with their willing ignorance of the world outside the castle. It went beyond his title. He had enjoyed their company early in his adolescence, but it had become apparent that he'd always be a step away. The worst of it was that they didn't seem to notice he was different, or that he felt different. Were it not for Cole, he would have felt immensely lonely. Well, his mother said, snapping her ivory fingers at one of her ladies in waiting, I'm sure your father has you busy, but when you find a moment to bother thinking of me and the fate of your kingdom, look through this. His mother's lady curtsied as she extended to him a folded piece of paper, stamped with his mother's blood-red seal. Dorian ripped it open and his stomach twisted at the long lines of names. All ladies of noble blood, all of marriageable age. What is this? He demanded, fighting the urge to rip up the paper. She gave him a winning smile. A list of potential brides. Any one of them would be suitable to take the crown, and all I've been told are quite capable of producing heirs. Dorian stuffed the list of names into the pocket of his vest. The restlessness within him would not cease. I'll think about it, he said, and before she could reply, he stepped from the awning-covered podium. Immediately 5 young women flocked to him and began asking him to dance, how he fared, if he would attend the Samhain ball. Around and around their words circled, and Dorian stared at them blankly. What were their names? He peered over their jewel-encrusted heads to find the path to the door. He'd suffocate if he remained here far too long. With only polite goodbyes, the crown prince strode from the jingle and jangle of the court, and the list of would-be brides burning a hole through his clothes and straight into his skin. Dorian put his hands in his pockets as he strode down the halls of the castle. The kennels were empty. The dogs were at the track. He'd wished to inspect one of the pregnant hounds, though he knew it was impossible to predict the outcome of the litter until she gave birth. He hoped the pups would be pure, but their mother had a tendency to escape from her pen. She was his fastest, but he'd never been able to quell the wildness within her. He didn't really know where he was going. He just needed to walk. Anywhere. Dorian loosened the top button on his vest. The clash of swords echoed from an open doorway, and he paused. He faced the champion's training room, and even though training was supposed to be over by now, there she was. Her golden hair shone as she wove in and out of a knot of 3 guards, a sword little more than a steel extension of a hand. She didn't balk at the guards as she dodged and twirled around them. Someone began clapping to the left, and the 4 dueling figures stopped, panting. Dorian watched a grin spreading across the assassin's face as she beheld the source. The sheen of sweat illuminating her high cheekbones, and her blue eyes sparkled. Yes, she was truly lovely. But Princess Nehemia approached, clapping. She was clad not in her usual white gown, but rather in a dark tunic and loose trousers, and she clutched an ornately carved wooden staff in one hand. The princess clasped the assassin on the shoulder and said something to the girl that made her laugh. Dorian looked around. Where was Cole or Brulo? Why was Adadan's assassin here with the Princess of Eloy, and with a sword? This could not go on, especially after that champion's attempted escape the other day. Dorian approached and smiled at the princess as he bowed. Nehemia only deigned to give him a terse nod. Not surprised, Dorian took Selena's hand. It smelled of metal and sweat, but he kissed it anyway, raising his eyes to her face as he did so. Lady Lillian, he murmured onto a sin. Your Highness, she said, trying to pull her hand from his, but Dorian held fast to her calloused palm. Might I have a word? He said, leading her away before she could agree. When they were out of hearing distance, he demanded. Where's Cole? She crossed her arms. Is this any way to speak to your beloved champion? He frowned. Where is he? I don't know. If I were to bet, though, I'd wager he's inspecting the eye at his mangled corpse, or disposing of Sven's body. Besides, Brulo said I could stay here as long as I liked after we were done. I do have another test tomorrow, you know. Of course, he knew. Why is Princess Nehemia here? She called on me, and when Philippa told her where I was, she insisted on joining. Apparently, a woman can only go so long without a sword between her hands. She bit her lip. I don't recall you being so talkative. Well, perhaps if you'd taken the time to speak with me, you'd have found me to be so. He snorted, but took the bait. Gods damn him. And when would I have spoken to you? You do recall the little fact that we travelled together from Endover, don't you? And that I've been here for weeks now? I sent you those books, he offered. And did you ever ask me if I read them? Had she forgotten to whom she was speaking? I've spoken to you once since we've been here. She shrugged and made to turn away. Irritated but slightly curious, he grabbed her arm. Her turquoise eyes glittered as she stared at his hand, and his heart quickened when her gaze rose to his face. Yes, sweaty as she was beautiful. Aren't you afraid of me? She glanced at his sword belt. Or are you as deft at handling a sword as Captain Westfall? He stepped closer, tightening his grip. Better, he whispered in her ear. There, she was blushing and blinking. Well, she began, but the timing was off. He'd won. She crossed her arms. Very amusing, Your Highness. He bowed dramatically. I do what I can, but you can't have Princess Nehemia with you. And why is that? Do you believe I'm going to kill her? Why would I kill the one person in this castle who isn't a blabbering idiot? She gave him a look that suggested he was part of the majority. Not to mention, her guards would kill me before I even lifted a hand. It simply can't happen. She's here to learn our customs, not to spar. She's a princess. She can do what she likes. And I suppose you're going to teach her about weaponry? She cocked her head. Perhaps you're just a little afraid of me. I'll escort her back to her chambers. She gestured happily for him to pass. Ward, help me. He ran a hand through his black hair and approached the princess, who waited for them with a hand on her hip. Your Highness, Dorian said, motioning to her personal guard to join them. I'm afraid we must return you to your chambers. The princess looked behind his shoulder with a raised eyebrow. To his dismay, Selena began speaking in Eloy to the princess, who stomped her staff. She hissed something at him. Dorian's skill with the Eloy language was spotty at best, and the princess spoke too fast for him to understand. Thankfully, the assassin translated. She says you can return to your cushions and dancing and leave us to be, Selena said. He tried his best to look serious. Tell her it's unacceptable for her to spar. Selena said something to which the princess only waved her hand and strode past them onto the sparring floor. What did you say? Dorian said. I said you volunteered to be her first partner, she said. Well, you don't want to upset the princess. I will not spar with the princess. Would you rather spar with me? Perhaps if we had a private session in your chambers, he said smoothly. Tonight? I'll be waiting. She curled her hair around a finger. The princess twirled her staff with a strength and precision that made him gulp. Deciding that he didn't feel like having the daylight swooped out of him, he walked to the rack of weapons and selected 2 wooden swords. How about some basic swordplay instead? He asked Nehemia. To his relief, the princess nodded and handed her staff to one of her guards, then took the practiced sword Dorian extended to her. Selena would not make a fool out of him. You stand like this, he said to the princess, taking a defensive stance.